I stood in the kitchen, my hands gliding over each dish under the warm water. The glimmering droplets reflected the soft yellow glow from the kitchen lamp, creating a familiar scene, a picture I had seen thousands of times over 28 years of marriage. Everything felt routine, as predictable as the passage of time, no surprises, no changes. Outside the window, the fading sunset cast a pale glow over the treetops. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, its sound carrying a quiet stillness, no different from the life I had grown accustomed to. Suddenly, the front door swung open, snapping me back to reality. Jack's footsteps echoed through the hall, steady and familiar, as always. But this time, his voice carried a strange energy, an unfamiliar excitement. "Helen! I'm home. And I've brought someone with me." I froze, my hand resting on the last dish, curiosity creeping into my thoughts. Jack rarely brought anyone home without mentioning it first. Drying my hands quickly, I adjusted the hem of my sweater, a habit left over from my younger days, as if I were still the girl who'd first met him. Stepping out of the kitchen, I saw Jack standing in the living room, bathed in the light from the chandelier. But behind him stood another figure, tall, broad-shouldered, exuding a confident presence that seemed to shrink the room. Jack turned toward me, his face glowing with excitement as he lightly patted the man's shoulder. "Helen, this is Evan Harper, my new colleague at work." I nodded politely, my eyes lingering briefly on the younger man. In the warm light, his face was striking, dark brown eyes deep and expressive, radiating a warmth but also a sharpness, like a freshly honed blade. His smile was gentle and courteous, but carried an elusive quality, as if he were fully aware of his own magnetism. "Hello, Mrs. Helen. It's a pleasure to meet you," Evan said. His voice was low and smooth, each word measured and deliberate, impossible to ignore. I forced a smile, feeling my heartbeat quicken slightly. "Hello," I replied, striving to keep my tone steady. But his smile left me feeling unsettled, as though I were standing before someone I shouldn't be looking at for too long. Jack remained animated, chatting about the project he and Evan were working on. I stood still, feeling like a mere backdrop to the familiar scene in our home. But Evan, with his youthful energy and vibrance, seemed to disrupt the usual stillness. "I figured working from home might be more comfortable," Jack said, gesturing toward the dining table. "We've got a few designs to review before the presentation next week." "Of course," Evan replied, nodding slightly. But his eyes flicked toward me, almost unintentionally. A fleeting glance, yet it made me feel as though I were being seen, truly seen, in a way I hadn't experienced in years. "Can you prepare something for us?" Jack asked, his voice brimming with enthusiasm as he turned to me. "Sure," I said, quickly turning away to hide my unease. Back in the kitchen, the atmosphere felt different. It wasn't Jack, he was still the hardworking, straightforward man he'd always been. It was Evan. He brought with him an air of freshness, a vitality I hadn't felt in this house for a long time. As I stood at the sink, focusing on making coffee, my mind wandered. Images of Evan flashed through my thoughts, his gentle smile, piercing eyes, and assured demeanor. I scolded myself. "What are you thinking? He's just Jack's colleague, a polite, young man with no reason to make you feel flustered." But no matter how hard I tried, an unfamiliar sensation lingered, strange and undeniable. How long had it been since I'd felt this way? The sense that someone truly noticed me, truly paid attention to me. Shaking my head, I pushed the thoughts aside. Deep down, though, I knew this evening would be different. Evan's presence had stirred something within me, something I hadn't realized I'd lost. When I returned to the living room, carrying a tray of coffee, the aroma filled the air, masking the subtle tension that hung in the room. Jack and Evan were seated at the dining table. Piles of files, sketches, and notes were spread out between them, creating a stark contrast. Jack, steady and familiar with his graying hair, and Evan, youthful and brimming with vitality. Jack didn't look up as I placed the tray down. He reached for his cup absent-mindedly, his eyes glued to the numbers on the page. "Thanks, Han," he said without glancing at me. I smiled faintly, then turned to Evan. He looked up, his gaze meeting mine, deep, unhurried, and deliberate. "Thank you, Mrs. Helen," he said, his voice low and warm, drawing my attention. When I handed him the cup, his fingers brushed against mine, just for a moment, but it was enough to jolt me. The sensation wasn't unpleasant, but neither was it entirely comfortable. It was unfamiliar, a feeling I couldn't quite name. Jack launched into a detailed explanation of their project, his voice filled with his usual enthusiasm. Words like budget, profit, and deadlines filled the air, but I found it impossible to concentrate. I settled into the armchair nearby, holding a magazine, though my eyes didn't focus on the pages. I flipped through them absently, my thoughts drifting to the two men at the table. Occasionally, I stole glances in their direction. Jack was the same as always, his hair streaked with gray, his expression serious yet familiar, the man I'd loved for nearly 3 decades. My memories of him were vivid, his smile on our wedding day, the way he'd held my hand when we bought our first home, and his single-minded dedication to work. But my gaze inevitably shifted to Evan. He was entirely different, youthful, dynamic, magnetic. His faint smile seemed to hide countless secrets, leaving me wondering what lay behind those dark brown eyes. I reminded myself, "Helen, you're 50. You've had a stable marriage for nearly 30 years. You don't need anything more." Yet the unfamiliar flutter in my chest refused to fade. What was this feeling? I didn't know. It wasn't love, no, it couldn't be. But it wasn't mere curiosity either. It felt like rediscovering something I hadn't realized I'd lost. Looking at Jack, still engrossed in his papers, I wondered, how long had it been since he truly looked at me, not as a wife, not as a homemaker, but as a person? When Evan looked at me, his gaze didn't just see me, it seemed to pierce through me. It didn't just see my form, it saw the empty spaces I had kept hidden, the parts of myself I'd forgotten. I closed my eyes briefly, trying to dispel these thoughts. But deep down, I knew that tonight had planted a seed within me, a seed of change, of something I dared not admit. Returning to the kitchen to prepare snacks, I heard laughter from the living room. Jack's laughter was familiar, but Evan's was different, low, warm, and like honey dripping into the quiet of the house. I paused for a moment, wondering why the sound unsettled me so much. Carrying out a tray of cookies, I tried to appear natural, but Evan's eyes seemed to follow my every move. He didn't say anything, just looked, but that gaze made me feel as though my every thought was exposed. The entire evening, I realized that Jack didn't notice anything outside of work. Meanwhile, I couldn't stop being drawn to Evan, his smile, his voice, even the way he adjusted his watch. That night, after Jack climbed into bed and fell asleep within minutes, I lay awake, Evan's gaze vivid in my mind. I told myself it was just my imagination, that everything would return to normal tomorrow. But I was wrong. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the glass of water in my hand as if it held the answers to all my swirling thoughts. My reflection on the glass door of the cabinet looked tired, older, and burdened. It was an image I had grown used to, but tonight, it felt different. The noise from the dining room, the sound of Jack's enthusiastic voice paired with Evan's calm replies, seemed to drift in and out of focus like a song playing in the distance. I sipped the water, but it did nothing to steady the turmoil within me. Instead, it felt as though each drop highlighted the dryness in my throat, a nervousness I couldn't quite shake. Taking a deep breath, I set the glass down and stepped closer to the kitchen door. From my angle, I could see Jack animatedly explaining something on the papers scattered across the dining table. Evan sat across from him, leaning slightly forward, his posture attentive yet relaxed. His focus on Jack was unwavering, but every so often, his hand would reach for his pen, and he'd jot down notes with effortless precision. I couldn't help but notice the contrast between them. Jack, with his slightly hunched shoulders and silvering hair, bore the marks of someone who had worked hard his entire life, often at the expense of other aspects of living. Evan, on the other hand, radiated youth and vitality. His every move seemed deliberate, as though he was always in control of the space around him. I caught myself staring and quickly turned away, ashamed. What was I doing? Why did I keep focusing on this young man? He was Jack's colleague, no more, no less. But my mind wouldn't let go of the way he'd looked at me in the car, the quiet, steady gaze that made me feel both exposed and alive. I busied myself with small tasks, wiping down the counter and rearranging items that didn't need rearranging. It was an attempt to distract myself from the knot of emotions tightening in my chest. Moments later, Jack's voice broke through my thoughts. "Helen, could you bring us some tea?" I hesitated, wiping my hands on a towel even though they weren't wet. Gathering myself, I prepared a tray with a teapot, cups, and a small plate of cookies, something to occupy my hands and keep my gaze elsewhere. When I entered the dining room, both men looked up. Jack smiled briefly before returning to his notes, but Evan's gaze lingered on me a moment longer. "Thank you, Helen," Jack said, reaching for a cup without looking. I nodded, setting the tray down carefully on the table. Evan leaned back slightly, giving me more room, and offered a polite smile. "Thanks, Mrs. Helen," he said, his voice as calm and composed as ever. I acknowledged him with a faint smile, keeping my eyes on the teapot as I poured. But I couldn't ignore the slight tension in the air, or perhaps it was just me imagining things. As I straightened up to leave, I felt Evan's gaze on me again, not intrusive but present, like the warmth of the sun through a window. It wasn't inappropriate, it was simply there, and it unnerved me. Returning to the kitchen, I leaned against the counter, staring at the clock on the wall. Time seemed to crawl, each tick echoing louder than the last. The thought crossed my mind to go upstairs, retreat to the bedroom, and let Jack handle the rest of the evening. But a part of me resisted, reluctant to leave the space where Evan's presence had so thoroughly disrupted the quiet monotony of my life. The evening wore on, with Jack and Evan continuing their work. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to read a cookbook I had no real interest in. Occasionally, their laughter would spill into the kitchen, and I'd find myself smiling despite the unease that lingered. When their work finally wrapped up, I heard Jack's chair scrape against the floor. "Thanks for coming over, Evan," Jack said, his tone warm. "It's great to have someone on the team who knows their stuff." "You're welcome, sir," Evan replied. "I appreciate the opportunity." They moved toward the front door, and I instinctively followed, unsure why. As Jack opened the door, Evan turned to me one last time. "Thank you again for the ride, Mrs. Helen," he said, his voice steady, with that same hint of warmth that made my stomach flutter. "It was no trouble," I said, keeping my tone light. Jack stepped out onto the porch with Evan, gesturing toward the driveway as he spoke. I stood in the doorway, watching the two of them converse, my hands gripping the edge of the doorframe as though it could anchor me. As Evan walked toward his car, he glanced back briefly, his eyes meeting mine. It was just a moment, a fleeting connection, but it felt significant, too significant. When I closed the door, the house felt emptier than it had before. Jack headed upstairs, his mind clearly preoccupied with work. I stood in the entryway, staring at the closed door and wondering why the air still felt charged, as if Evan's presence lingered in the space he had just left. Later that night, as Jack fell into his usual deep sleep beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My thoughts swirled with fragments of the evening, the rain, the music, the look in Evan's eyes. What was happening to me? I told myself it was nothing, just an overactive imagination fueled by a dull routine. But deep down, I couldn't deny the truth, something had shifted. And though I didn't know where it would lead, I knew one thing for certain, I was no longer the same. Scene 4, an unforgettable moment. The evening dragged on, each moment stretching longer than usual, as if time itself had decided to slow down. I curled up in the corner of the living room, holding an old novel in my hands, but my eyes refused to settle on any of the words. Jack and Evan were seated at the dining table, deeply immersed in the drawings and plans spread before them. Their conversation flowed steadily. Jack was animated and meticulous, while Evan responded with calm precision and sharp insight. I tried to focus on the book, forcing myself to read each line, but it was futile. Every time I glanced up, I found Evan's eyes flickering toward me, brief and fleeting. Yet in those moments, there was a vague intensity in his gaze, as if he were trying to decipher the things I was determined to hide. I turned away quickly, my heart beating faster than it should. Why did his gaze affect me like this? Why did it feel as though he could see parts of me that no one else noticed? When their meeting finally concluded, Evan stood, gathering the documents neatly into a pile before shaking Jack's hand firmly. Jack smiled, clearly satisfied, and wished him a good night. For no particular reason, I found myself following them to the door. I had no reason to be there, no real purpose, and yet I couldn't stop myself. As Evan stepped down the porch steps, the soft glow of the street lamp cast his silhouette in sharp relief against the quiet night. He stopped and turned to look at me. His face remained composed, but his eyes, those eyes, seemed to hold unspoken words, things he couldn't bring himself to say aloud. "Good night, Mrs. Helen," he said softly, his voice low and warm, like the lingering notes of a jazz tune that refused to fade away. I nodded, trying to summon a smile, but the storm inside me left me speechless. He turned and walked away, his steps unhurried, confident, until his figure disappeared into the darkness. I stood there, my hand resting lightly on the doorframe, watching him go as though drawn into a void I couldn't escape. When I finally realized how long I'd been standing there, I felt the stiffness in my legs. I closed the door quietly, the sound echoing faintly in the stillness of the house. It was as if I had just stepped out of a dream, but the feeling lingered, refusing to let me go. Later, lying in bed, the soft yellow light of the bedside lamp bathed the room in a quiet glow. Jack was fast asleep beside me, his steady breathing filling the silence. It was a sound I had once found comforting, but tonight, it only emphasized the emptiness within me. I turned onto my side, staring at the ceiling, unable to quiet my mind. Images of Evan replayed in my thoughts like a film on an endless loop, his voice, his gaze, the music he had played earlier that day. I asked myself, what's happening to me? Why am I so drawn to him? But deep down, I knew this wasn't just a passing distraction. It wasn't something I could simply brush aside. This was a feeling I had buried for years, a longing to be seen, to be noticed, to truly feel alive. I closed my eyes, hoping to escape my thoughts, but the image of Evan remained vivid, filling the darkness behind my eyelids. I knew, no matter how hard I tried, sleep would not come to me tonight. And somewhere in the depths of my heart, a truth emerged, unwelcome and undeniable: this was only the beginning. Something larger, something unpredictable, was waiting just beyond the horizon. A week passed in silence, not the kind of calm, peaceful silence, but a heavy, oppressive stillness that made the passing days feel longer. That evening, Jack had gone to bed early, exhausted from another grueling day of work. I sat alone on the sofa, bathed in the dim yellow glow of the living room lamp. The ticking of the wall clock was the only sound, slicing through the quiet. As I began to rise to tidy up, my phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the stillness. I reached for it, and my heart skipped a beat when the name Evan Harper lit up the screen. I opened the message, reading each word slowly, as if they carried a weight that pulled me back toward a truth I had been avoiding. "Mrs. Helen, thank you for driving me home last week. It was raining that day, but because of you, I felt very warm." I stared at the message, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to delete it immediately, to pretend I'd never seen it. But another part, deeper, quieter, and undeniably vulnerable, wanted to respond, to hold on to the feeling of being noticed, something I hadn't felt in so long. Finally, I typed carefully, choosing my words with precision, striving for normalcy. "It was nothing, Evan. You're a good colleague of Jack's. I was just doing what was needed." I hit send, but my eyes lingered on the screen. The soft glow of the phone felt almost too bright in the dim room, casting shadows that mirrored the unease growing inside me. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for: silence, to help me return to normalcy, or a reply that would prolong this strange, inexplicable connection. And then it came. "You're not just kind, you're special. I've never met anyone like you." I read the words once, then again. They were simple, yet they carried a weight I couldn't ignore. It felt as though Evan had spoken directly to a part of me I had hidden away, a part one barely recognized anymore. I pressed my lips together, trying to suppress the storm of emotions rising within me. I told myself it was nothing more than a polite compliment, harmless words meant to express gratitude. But my heart betrayed my logic, pounding faster and harder, reminding me of something I hadn't felt in years. Jack was a good husband, a loyal partner. But over the years, our love had settled into a predictable rhythm, a routine devoid of the passion and spontaneity it once had. I had convinced myself I was content with that, or at least, I thought I had. Yet Evan's message, a mere string of words, made me feel alive again. It was a dangerous feeling, vibrant and intoxicating, but undeniably dangerous. I set the phone down, but the glow of the screen seemed to burn into my mind. I knew I shouldn't respond. I knew this path could lead to chaos, to things I couldn't undo. But deep inside, a small part of me longed for the next message. For the first time in years, I felt like Helen, not just a wife, not just a homemaker, but a person who was truly seen. What started as a single message grew into a quiet but irresistible habit. At first, the exchanges were light-hearted and harmless. "Did Jack give you a headache today?" "No more than usual." "And you? How's work treating you?" The innocent banter gradually evolved into longer conversations about music, dreams, even the kind of thoughts I hadn't dared to voice in years. Evan had a way of making everything seem effortless. He asked questions that felt meaningful, questions no one had ever thought to ask me before. Questions that forced me to look inward, to examine the pieces of myself I'd left behind. One evening, Jack was upstairs, caught up in a late-night video conference. Evan had stopped by unexpectedly to discuss an urgent project. After Jack retreated to his study with his laptop, Evan and I found ourselves alone in the quiet kitchen. The soft yellow light above the marble counter bathed the room in a warm glow, wrapping everything in a comforting stillness. Evan leaned casually against the counter, a glass of water in hand. His eyes, calm yet piercing, carried a kind of attention I hadn't felt in a long time. "Have you ever thought about leaving Portland?" he asked, breaking the silence. The question caught me off guard. "Of course," I replied, attempting to sound nonchalant. But Jack didn't want to, and I got used to being here. Evan tilted his head slightly, his deep brown eyes holding mine. "You don't have to live your life out of habit. Portland is beautiful, but it's not everything." His words were gentle, yet they landed like a stone thrown into a still pond, sending ripples through waters I had worked so hard to keep calm. I lowered my gaze, fidgeting with the dish towel on the counter. "It's not always easy to change," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Evan was silent for a moment before offering a small smile. "I understand. But sometimes, change is necessary. For yourself." His words struck a chord deep within me. Whether he knew it or not, he had touched on my deepest fear, the fear that I had allowed my life to become consumed by routine, by comfort, by familiarity. For years, I had lived in the same cycle, Jack, the house, the same dinners, the same conversations. I had convinced myself that this was happiness, that I needed nothing more. But now, standing in the quiet glow of the kitchen, hearing Evans speak truths I hadn't even dared to admit to myself, I wasn't so sure anymore. I looked at him, tall, confident, his presence both grounding and electrifying. He exuded a vitality I had long forgotten, a belief that life held more than the comfortable monotony I had accepted. But I also knew he was dangerous. He was a fire, one that could warm me, but also one that could destroy everything I had built over the past 28 years. I met his gaze once more, but instead of responding, I offered a faint smile. A smile that I wasn't sure he would understand. Jack's voice called down from upstairs, breaking the stillness. Evan set his glass down and turned to leave the kitchen, pausing only to glance back at me one last time. "Good night, Mrs. Helen," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight I couldn't place. As the door closed behind him, I stood there alone, feeling like I had just survived an unseen storm. Evan's words echoed in my mind, stirring fears and desires I had long buried. And in that moment, I knew this was far from over. That morning, with Jack away on a business trip, the house fell into its familiar, empty quiet. I wandered through the rooms, the sound of my footsteps echoing in a way that only emphasized the void. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, as though I were trapped in a vacuum with no way out. My phone buzzed on the table, jolting me from my wandering thoughts. I picked it up, and there it was, a message from Evan. "It's a beautiful day. Would you like to go for a walk?" I stared at the words, my fingers hovering indecisively above the screen. Logic told me to decline, to keep my distance, but the monotony and solitude of the morning nudged me forward. "See you at Washington Park at 4. Washington Park was breathtaking that April afternoon. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting playful patterns of light and shadow on the stone paths. The air was fresh with the scent of grass and blooming flowers, a reminder of spring's quiet promise. I found Evan waiting on a bench near the pond, dressed simply in a crisp white shirt, a paper coffee cup in his hand. When he saw me, he smiled, a smile so warm it seemed to brighten the entire scene. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice gentle but filled with an attention that made me feel momentarily unsteady. I nodded, managing a small smile. I needed some fresh air. We began walking along the winding paths of the park, our steps unhurried, our conversation flowing easily. Time seemed to melt away as we talked, as though the world had paused just for us. Evan shared stories of his family in Chicago, his jazz-loving mother, and the dreams he had yet to fulfill, a trip to Italy, opening a small cafe, or simply finding true meaning in life. "What about you, Helen?" he asked suddenly, his question catching me off guard. "Do you have any dreams you haven't chased yet?" I stopped walking, staring down at my shoes, sunlight breaking through the canopy to dapple the ground. His question was too unexpected, too personal. I don't know," I said softly, my voice so faint I barely heard it myself. "Maybe I stopped dreaming a long time ago." Evan paused and turned to me, his gaze kind yet intense, filled with an understanding that felt almost intrusive. "You can still start again," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "It's never too late to live for yourself." His words pierced through me, cutting to the core of the fears and longings I had buried for so many years. I looked up at him, and for a moment, I felt as though I stood at a crossroads in my life, one I hadn't realized existed until now. I didn't respond. Instead, I started walking again. But with each step, Evan's words echoed in my mind, like a soft but persistent reminder that everything didn't have to stay the same, that change was still possible. As we strolled beneath the shaded trees, I found myself wondering, when had I stopped dreaming? When had I settled for a life that felt comfortable but hollow? Evan wasn't just Jack's young colleague. He was like a mirror, reflecting back the parts of myself I had lost, the passion, the belief, the person I used to be. But could I dare to live for myself? Or would I remain tethered to the responsibilities and routines I had wrapped myself in for nearly 3 decades? When we left the park that afternoon, I knew one thing for certain: Evan's words had planted a seed of change in me. And though I had no idea what lay ahead, I could no longer ignore that seed growing inside me. In the days that followed, I found myself caught in a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't escape. Evan's presence in my life wasn't just that of Jack's colleague, it was like a gust of wind, sweeping away the dust that had settled on my soul for years. But at the same time, he was a storm, an undercurrent of chaos that left me feeling unsettled, as though I were teetering on the edge of something both thrilling and dangerous. That evening, after Jack had fallen asleep, I lay in bed, the glow of the bedside lamp illuminating the book in my hands, a book I couldn't focus on reading. My phone rested silently on the nightstand, yet it felt as though it were calling out to me, pulling me away from the heavy quiet of the night. I reached for it, unlocked the screen, and instinctively opened the thread of messages with Evan. The short exchanges, the casual questions, the small moments of kindness, they all appeared before me like a lifeline in the dark. I read through them again and again, each word a flicker of light in the shadows of my heart. I asked myself, is this right? Is this okay? But instead of finding an answer, I did something I knew I shouldn't. My fingers moved almost on their own, typing the words my heart had been quietly whispering. "Are you thinking about me?" The moment I sent it, my breath caught, my heart pounding with equal parts fear and anticipation. The screen lit up in the darkness, and within a minute, his reply came through. "Always." 2 simple words, yet they shook me to my core. I set the phone down, unable to look away from the screen. I knew this wasn't right. I knew I was venturing onto a path fraught with danger, one I might never be able to return from. But at the same time, I couldn't deny the sense of vitality Evan brought into my life. I couldn't remember the last time Jack had said something that made my heart flutter. Not because he didn't love me, but because our love had become a safe, predictable rhythm, a quiet background to our shared life. But Evan, he didn't see me as just a wife, a homemaker, or a middle-aged woman. He saw me as a person, someone with feelings, desires, and dreams I had long since buried. The questions swirled endlessly in my mind. What am I doing? Why am I letting this happen? But instead of seeking answers, I clutched the phone tightly, waiting for his next message, like an addict awaiting their next fix. That night, I didn't sleep. The words always echoed in my mind, a haunting refrain that refused to fade. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Friday evening, Jack returned home after a long day at work. He walked into the kitchen, shrugging off his coat as he said, "I have to attend a last-minute conference in Seattle this weekend. They just changed the schedule. I'll be leaving early tomorrow morning." I nodded, keeping my face neutral. "Let me help you pack," I offered, but inside, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. Jack smiled appreciatively and headed upstairs. The kitchen fell silent again, save for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. I sat down with my cup of tea, but just as I was about to take a sip, my phone vibrated on the table. The name Evan Harper lit up the screen, and my heart immediately began to race. I opened the message and read each word slowly, as if they carried a weight that could crush or uplift me. "Are you free this weekend?" I stared at the text, the room seeming to close in around me. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, torn between caution and temptation. Logic whispered that I should decline, that nothing good could come from this. But curiosity, longing, and a nameless ache pushed me forward. "I'm free. Do you have something in mind?" The message was sent, and for a moment, I regretted it. But before I could dwell on my decision, his reply came quickly. "I'd like to see you. At your house, if possible." His audacious suggestion stunned me. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound almost deafening in the quiet kitchen. I stared at the screen, feeling as though my very heartbeat was visible in the stillness. This was a line, a decision that could change everything. One wrong step could destroy the life I had built over nearly 30 years. And yet, a part of me was irresistibly drawn to the idea, to the danger of it. Jack won't be here, I reasoned, as if that made it any less precarious. It's just a conversation. Nothing more. But even as I thought it, I knew I was lying to myself. I set the phone down, but it felt as though it burned into my palm. I paced the kitchen, trying to shake off the turmoil in my mind. Yet, no matter how hard I tried, Evan's face, his deep eyes, his gentle smile, kept resurfacing in my thoughts. Picking up the phone again, my trembling fingers typed a response. My heart had made the decision before my mind could intervene. "Tomorrow, after 2 p.m. Jack will be gone." The message was sent, and the air in the room seemed to thicken. My pulse quickened, not out of fear, but out of an emotion I couldn't name, a heady mix of anticipation and recklessness. I knew, from that moment forward, there would be no turning back. The next morning, Jack left the house in his usual hurried manner, his suitcase rolling noisily on the brick path. I stood by the window, watching his car disappear down the long, straight road. The pale morning sunlight filtered through the trees, casting soft shadows on the quiet street, a serene scene that felt anything but peaceful. A pang of guilt stirred in my chest, a shadow reminding me of what I was about to do. Yet, almost immediately, an unfamiliar thrill surged within me, like a spark I couldn't extinguish. By the time the afternoon sun softened its glare, the doorbell rang, breaking the tense quiet of the house. I opened the door, and there he was. Evan stood on the porch, wearing a simple white shirt, holding a small bouquet of pale purple wildflowers. Their simplicity made them unexpectedly beautiful, much like him. "Hello," he said, his deep, steady voice cutting through the stillness, each word deliberate and resonant. I managed a soft smile, keeping my tone calm. "Hello." I took the flowers, their delicate petals brushing against my fingertips, carrying a subtle, indescribable fragrance. "Thank you. These are lovely." "Just a small token of appreciation," Evan replied, his gaze lingering on me longer than it needed to. I stepped aside, inviting him in, and followed him into the living room. The air was thick with tension, the silence almost tangible. Evan wandered over to the bookshelf, examining the framed photos of my family, pictures of Jack, of me, of vacations and memories from another lifetime. I retreated to the kitchen, busied myself with the teapot, and tried to hide my nervous hands. The sound of running water, the clinking of porcelain, all of it merged with the palpable unease hanging in the air. "This house is beautiful," Evan said from the living room, breaking the silence. I paused, listening. "But don't you think it's too quiet?" he added. His words cut through me like a blade, striking at the heart of the emptiness I had worked so hard to ignore. Sometimes, I admitted, my voice barely audible, as though the admission itself was dangerous. Evan stepped closer, his movements deliberate yet unthreatening. His eyes were gentle but magnetic, holding a depth that seemed to unravel every defense I had built over the years. "You don't have to live in that quiet forever," he said, his voice low but resolute. "You deserve to be happy, Helen." The simple statement made my chest tighten. His words, spoken so plainly, felt like an undeniable truth, one I had been too afraid to face. This quiet wasn't peace, it was emptiness. I didn't know how to respond. The rational part of me screamed to end this, to walk away before the line was crossed. But another part, a weaker, more vulnerable part, wanted to stay, to listen, to feel. This was the moment I knew I was standing on the edge of an irreversible decision. I placed the teacup on the table, forcing my voice to remain steady. "You don't understand, Evan." But his gaze didn't waver. It held me in place, as if silently insisting he understood more than I thought. I realized then that this conversation wasn't just beginning, it was a prelude to something much larger, something that would inevitably change everything. Evan sat on the sofa, his posture relaxed yet exuding the calm confidence that seemed to define him. I chose a chair opposite him, keeping a safe distance, a boundary I hoped would protect us both. The room was bathed in soft light from the table lamp, creating an atmosphere that was both cozy and tinged with mystery. At first, we talked about simple things, hobbies, music, dreams of travels I had never dared to imagine. "Italy, huh?" I asked, keeping my tone light. Evan smiled, a mix of wistfulness and quiet longing. "Yes. I've always wanted to stand in front of the Trevi fountain, savor an espresso, and just watch the world go by." I nodded gently. The image he painted was so vivid, so beautiful, it made me feel small within the confines of my routine life. But then, in a brief moment of silence, the space between us seemed to grow heavier, as if the very air had thickened. Evan's eyes locked onto mine, not with the polite curiosity of a friend or colleague, but with a raw sincerity and yearning that was impossible to ignore. He leaned forward slightly, the gap between us narrowing. I could feel the tension in the room rising, each movement drawing us closer. "Do you ever feel like you've missed something in life?" he asked, his voice soft yet piercing, each word striking a nerve deep within me. I didn't answer right away. The question was too direct, too honest, and I wasn't sure I had the courage to respond. I simply looked into his eyes, eyes that carried an understanding, an invitation I couldn't brush aside. Evan leaned in closer, and I could feel his breath blending with the charged air around us. My heartbeat quickened, each thud reverberating through my body. Then, his lips brushed against mine. It wasn't a hurried or passionate kiss. It was gentle, almost hesitant, as if he were seeking my permission rather than demanding it. And yet, that tenderness overwhelmed me. The kiss wasn't just a meeting of lips, it was an opening to a world I had forgotten existed, a world where I felt desired, alive, and utterly present. When his lips left mine, I sat frozen, unable to speak. The unfamiliar emotions swirling inside me were equal parts intoxicating and devastating. I didn't know what to do. All I knew was that this moment had changed everything. It had awakened something long dormant within me, a sense of vitality and longing that was both exhilarating and terrifying. A question echoed in my mind, over and over, is this right? Or have I strayed too far? But in that moment, I had no answer. All I knew was that my heart was pounding harder than it ever had before, and I had stepped into a place I had never dared to go. As the kiss ended, Evan leaned back slightly, his expression a mix of tenderness and inner conflict. His eyes, filled with regret and understanding, made me want to both step closer and retreat. "I'm sorry if this was wrong," he said, his voice low and deliberate, each word carrying the weight of his emotions. "No," I whispered, my voice catching in my throat. "It's not your fault." The words tumbled out before I had a chance to think. But they weren't entirely true, and I knew it. Inside me, a tempest was raging. I felt the pull of conflicting emotions, desire, guilt, and a bittersweet joy I hadn't experienced in years. Jack, my loyal and devoted husband, he didn't deserve this. Yet I couldn't deny that, for the first time in so long, I felt truly alive. Evan had reawakened something I thought I had lost forever. Evan, I hesitated, unsure how to break the suffocating tension between us. He looked at me, his gaze filled with understanding. "It's okay," he said, his hand gently resting on mine, a gesture that was both comforting and disarming. "I'm here, and I care about you. The decision is yours." His words felt like an anchor and a lifeline, making me want to cry. He wasn't pushing or demanding anything, he was giving me the space to choose, even though I knew that choice was far from simple. Evan stood up, his smile soft, carrying a mix of compassion and quiet resignation. "I don't want you to feel pressured," he said, his voice as gentle as a breeze. "I'll leave, if that's what you want." I looked at him, my lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. I didn't know what I wanted or what I should do. All I knew was that as he stepped out of the room, it felt like a part of my heart followed him. The door closed softly behind him, and the room fell silent once more. I sat in the chair, staring down at my hands, feeling as though the energy had been drained from my body. I wasn't sure if what I had just done was right or wrong. I knew it was a betrayal, not just to Jack, but to the version of myself I had always tried to uphold. Yet, I also couldn't deny that in that moment, I had felt a fierce, undeniable aliveness I hadn't felt in years. Evan had shown me a glimpse of something I had forgotten, the capacity to feel deeply, to be seen, and to be wanted. I didn't know what would come next. But I knew one thing for certain, from this moment on, my life would never be the same. Sunday evening, I curled up on the sofa, trying to immerse myself in the book resting in my hands. Yet the letters on the page danced before my eyes, refusing to form any coherent meaning. Outside, the sky darkened, and the dim light from the street lamp filtered through the window, casting faint shadows on the floor. Suddenly, the familiar sound of an engine approaching broke the stillness, and my heart skipped a beat. Jack. I glanced at the clock on the wall, 6 p.m. He wasn't supposed to be back until tomorrow. Rising quickly, I felt a wave of anxiety swell in my chest. But I forced myself to breathe, to calm down. "It's fine," I told myself. "He doesn't know anything." The door opened, letting in a rush of cold evening air. Jack stepped inside, his face lit with a smile that hinted at satisfaction. "The conference ended earlier than expected," he announced, placing his bag on the floor. "I came home to surprise you." I managed a weak smile, but the tightness in my throat made my voice tremble more than I intended. What a surprise! Jack didn't seem to notice my unease. He shrugged off his coat and sank into the sofa with a relaxed demeanor. He began recounting his trip, the people he'd met, the presentations he'd attended, and the exciting new projects he wanted to pursue. I sat across from him, nodding along, pretending to listen, but my thoughts were elsewhere. They spun in circles, like a small boat caught in a whirlpool of fear. Does he suspect anything? I couldn't tell if my behavior had shifted enough to alert him. Every word Jack spoke seemed to drift past me like a breeze, leaving no trace. My mind clung to one question: has he noticed? In recent days, I had crossed a line I never thought I'd approach. Evan, his name haunted me like a shadow, evoking both a quick impulse and a pang of guilt each time I thought of him. I looked at Jack, the familiar lines of his face, the warmth of his smile, the enthusiasm with which he shared his plans for the future. He hadn't changed. But it was this very consistency that now felt suffocating. Had I changed too much? Or had he grown so accustomed to the routine of our life that he failed to notice anything unusual? Jack ended his story with a grin, his eyes bright with excitement. I'm so glad I got home early. We have an extra evening together. Me too, I replied softly, though my heart felt heavy. As Jack started talking about his plans for the upcoming week, I felt like I was perched on a fragile wire, ready to snap. All I could do was keep pretending, hoping he wouldn't see the cracks forming beneath my facade. 2 days later, Jack casually announced that he had invited Evan over for dinner to discuss their project. My heart plummeted. Evan's coming over tonight. I thought it'd be more comfortable to work at home, and you always make the best dinners, Jack said, his cheerful smile betraying no suspicion of my inner turmoil. I forced a calm expression and smiled lightly. That's great. I'll make something nice. But deep inside, a torrent of unease surged, like an unstoppable undercurrent threatening to pull me under. That evening, as the clock struck 7, the doorbell rang. I wiped my hands on my apron, bracing myself to stay composed. Evan stood on the doorstep, his usual confident and polite demeanor intact. But tonight, there was something different about the way he entered, an unspoken familiarity that made the air in the house feel charged. Good evening, Evan, I greeted, keeping my tone steady. Good evening, Mrs. Helen, he replied, his gaze lingering on me a fraction too long before shifting to Jack, who stood nearby with a stack of documents in hand. I busied myself in the kitchen, taking longer than usual to prepare dinner, as if prolonging the task could shield me from the tension in the living room. Jack and Evan sat at the dining table, their conversation lively as they discussed their project. Jack's laughter echoed warmly through the space, mingling with Evan's deep, measured responses. But each time I heard Evan's voice, I felt an invisible thread tightening between us, a tension that only he and I seemed to understand. When I finally brought dinner to the table, I could feel Evan's gaze follow me. His glance was fleeting but carried an unspoken connection that sent a shiver down my spine. At one point, as I poured Jack a glass of water, his laughter pulled my attention back to him. Jack was telling a joke, and Evan nodded along, but his eyes weren't on Jack, they were on me. His gaze was no longer that of a colleague or guest. It was deeper, laden with an understanding and a shared secret that I refused to acknowledge yet couldn't ignore. My chest tightened. I quickly turned away, fumbling for something to occupy my hands. But the tremor in my fingers betrayed me, causing the glass I held to nearly slip. Evan knew. That look confirmed my deepest fear. He knew the effect he had on me, and he knew I was powerless to resist it. Jack, on the other hand, sat oblivious, unaware of the subtle undercurrent that electrified the room. He didn't see the way I avoided meeting Evan's eyes or the slight quiver in my movements. I told myself it would be fine, that this evening would pass like any other. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. An invisible thread bound Evan and me together, tightening with every passing moment, making it harder and harder to sever. After dinner, as I cleaned the dishes, I kept my hands busy, hoping to calm the storm inside me. Jack and Evan continued their discussion in the living room, their voices fading into the background of my thoughts. This evening wasn't just a dinner. It was another step toward something I had tried to avoid but couldn't stop yearning for. When Jack excused himself to take a call upstairs, the room fell into an oppressive silence. I fiddled with a glass on the table, turning it over in my hands, desperate for distraction. "Are you okay?" Evan's voice broke through the quiet, soft yet resonant, pulling me from my thoughts. I glanced up briefly, then quickly looked away. "Not really," I murmured, my voice barely audible. Evan stepped closer, maintaining a respectful distance, but enough for me to feel the weight of his presence. "I don't want to cause you trouble, Helen," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "But I can't pretend I don't feel this way." I turned to face him, his gaze holding mine with a sincerity that felt both comforting and dangerous. "Evan, it can't happen," I whispered, my voice tight with emotion. "I can't do this to Jack." He didn't argue. His eyes stayed on me, filled with an understanding that cut through every defense I had. "You're not happy," he said simply, his words slicing through the facade I had spent years constructing. "I can see it." Those words hit me like a blow. Yes, I wasn't happy. But admitting that, to him, to myself, felt like stepping off a cliff. "Don't make me choose," I said, my voice barely holding together. Evan nodded, his expression heavy with sadness. "I don't want to pressure you. But I can't ignore this." His words left me torn in half, caught between the safety and love Jack represented and the undeniable pull I felt toward Evan. Before I could respond, Jack's footsteps echoed on the stairs. Evan stepped back, his face resuming its usual calm, as if nothing had happened. I turned away, forcing myself to look busy as Jack entered, his cheerful demeanor unchanged. But inside, I felt the chaos roaring louder. I was standing on the edge of two worlds, one safe and familiar, the other dangerous yet irresistible. I knew I had to make a decision soon. But whichever path I chose, I was certain of one thing: nothing would ever be the same again. That night, after Evan left, I buried myself in small tasks, clearing the table, washing the dishes, wiping down the countertops. I performed each action with an exaggerated focus, desperate to distract my mind from the chaos within. But as soon as I placed the last dish in the sink, Jack's voice startled me from behind. "Helen, what's going on?" "You've been different lately," he said. His tone was calm, but there was a hint of suspicion I couldn't ignore. I turned around, my body stiffening as though my senses had frozen. "Different? What do you mean?" Jack took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied me, searching for something I didn't want him to find. "You're quieter, more distracted. It's like you're carrying a weight I don't know about. Is there something you're not telling me?" My chest tightened. His words cut through the carefully constructed facade I had been clinging to. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The silence between us stretched unbearably, each second carving through the air like a knife. Jack's gaze grew sharper, his voice steadier as he pressed on. "Don't tell me there's something going on between you and Evan." His words landed like a blow, and I held my breath as the world seemed to stop. "Jack, it's not what you think," I stammered, my voice weak and trembling. "So there is something," he interrupted, his tone steady but laced with quiet devastation. He wasn't shouting, but the weight of his disappointment struck harder than raised voices ever could. My heart felt like it had stopped beating. The emotions I had been suppressing, the guilt, fear, and shame, rose to the surface, crashing over me in waves. And when I met Jack's eyes, filled with a mix of disbelief and hurt, I knew I had betrayed not just him but the foundation of the life we'd built together. I looked away, my head bowed as I struggled to find the words. But every sentence felt meaningless, and my silence became an answer in itself. Jack stood there, his shoulders heavy with the weight of unspoken accusations. His eyes held a mix of anger and sadness, a pain I had inflicted but didn't know how to heal. Helen, I need you to tell me the truth, he said, his voice quieter now, but charged with urgency. I looked up at him, feeling like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, one wrong move away from losing everything I had known for 28 years. But I still couldn't speak. My silence said more than I ever could, and in that moment, I saw the flicker of understanding in Jack's eyes. He knew. That night, the house was suffocating in its silence. I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, each second stretching into an eternity. From upstairs, I could hear Jack pacing in his office. The sound of his steady footsteps echoed through the quiet, a constant reminder of the storm I had unleashed. Sleep didn't come. His words, his expression, the stillness of the house, all of it replayed in my mind like a tape I couldn't stop. The next morning, when I came downstairs, Jack was sitting in the living room. The morning light streamed through the window, illuminating his face. He looked worn, his eyes heavy with exhaustion and pain. He turned to me, his voice calm but strained. Helen, I don't know what's happened, but we need to talk. We can't go on like this. I stopped in my tracks, feeling as though all the strength in my body had drained away. Jack, I began, my voice trembling. I'm sorry. I don't know how it got to this point. I've been feeling lost. Jack nodded silently, his hands clasped tightly together as he held my gaze. What do you want now? He asked, his voice still gentle, but the question weighed heavily between us. His words felt like a knife slicing through me. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know if I had the courage to tell him the truth or the clarity to make a choice. I don't know, I said, my voice barely audible. Jack, I don't want to hurt you. But I don't know how to fix this. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, as though studying himself. When he opened them, I saw the raw emotion, the hurt, the disappointment, and the faint glimmer of hope. I don't need things to go back to the way they were, Helen, he said, his voice hoarse. I just need to know if there's still a chance for us. I don't want to lose you, but I can't live in a lie. I stood frozen, caught between two worlds, one of comfort and familiarity with Jack, and the other of longing and vitality that Evan had stirred within me. Jack's words made the weight of my choices all the more apparent. He deserved better. He deserved honesty. And yet, the pull I felt toward Evan was undeniable. I don't know, I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. Jack studied me for a long moment before standing, moving toward the window. The light framed his silhouette, highlighting the burden he carried. I'll give you time, he said finally, his tone heavy with resignation. But you have to decide, Helen. We can't keep living like this. As he walked away, I felt like the ground beneath me was crumbling. And in that moment, I knew I could no longer avoid the truth. A decision had to be made, no matter how painful or irreversible it might be. After the heavy conversation the night before, Jack was quieter than ever. He left the house early that morning, leaving me alone with a cold breakfast untouched on the table. The silence of the house was oppressive. I tried to busy myself, cleaning, tending to the potted plants on the porch, but no matter what I did, my mind kept circling back to Jack's expression, the pain in his eyes, mixed with a silent plea for an answer I couldn't yet give. Around noon, a message from Evan popped up on my phone. Are you okay? I stared at the words for what felt like forever before replying. I don't know. Everything's a mess. Less than a minute later, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. I hesitated but eventually answered. You don't have to go through this alone, Evan said, his voice warm and steady, brimming with concern. If you need me, just say the word. I closed my eyes, torn apart by conflicting emotions. Evan, this isn't easy. Jack, he doesn't deserve this. And you don't deserve to feel invisible, Evan replied, his tone both firm and gentle. That afternoon, I decided to meet Evan at a small cafe in the west side of town. He was already waiting by the window with a coffee in front of him. When I walked in, his face lit up, but he remained quiet, waiting for me to sit down. Evan, this thing between us, it shouldn't have happened, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But it did, he replied calmly. You can't deny how you feel, just as I can't deny how I feel about you. I looked at him, my heart a swirling mix of emotions. I love Jack. He's my family. But, you make me feel alive again. I don't know what to do with that. Evan offered a faint, bittersweet smile. You don't have to decide now. But you deserve a life where you don't have to suppress your feelings. Our conversation ended in silence. As I stood to leave, Evan reached out and gently held my hand. His eyes seemed to memorize me, as though he was bracing himself for whatever came next. No matter what you choose, I just want you to be happy, Helen, he said softly. When I returned home, Jack was sitting in the living room. His expression was no longer cold but carried an unexpected tenderness. We need to talk, he said, his voice calm, almost patient. I nodded and sat across from him, feeling a familiar knot in my chest tighten. Helen, I know we've been distant for a long time, Jack began, his eyes briefly flicking to my hands, which were nervously clasped together. Maybe I've been too caught up in work to see what really matters. No, Jack, I interrupted, shaking my head. This isn't just your fault. I let myself sink into old routines too. We're both to blame. He took a deep breath and continued. I don't want to lose you, Helen. If you're willing, we can start over. His words caught me off guard. I stared at Jack, the man who had stood by my side through every high and low, the man who had once been my entire world. I knew this was a chance to mend what had been broken. The following week, Jack suggested we take a trip to a small cabin in the Colorado mountains, a place we had visited 28 years ago on our honeymoon. The idea surprised me. Jack, who was always immersed in work and avoided unnecessary plans, was now suggesting something so symbolic. I think we need some space, he explained, his tone gentle yet resolute. Just the two of us. To talk. To remember why we started this journey together. I stayed silent for a long moment before nodding. I wasn't sure what would happen, but deep down, I knew I wanted to rediscover the part of us that had been lost. The cabin was nestled among snow-covered peaks, surrounded by towering pines. The air was cold but crisp, and the solitude brought a strange sense of peace. One evening, as we sat on the balcony under a sky full of stars, Jack suddenly reached for my hand. His touch was warm, his hand trembling slightly as though he was searching for the right words. Helen, he began, his voice low and measured. I know I've made you feel alone. I know I've been so focused on work that I forgot we need excitement, connection. I turned to look at him, his words hitting the raw, unspoken truths I had buried. I want to try harder, Jack continued, his gaze unwavering. Not just to keep you, but to make you happy. We can't go back to how we were, but maybe we can start again. What do you think? I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his sincerity in every word. There was something in his eyes, not disappointment, not blame, but a glimmer of hope, that made me want to try. I want to try too, I whispered, my voice barely audible but filled with emotion. Jack tightened his grip on my hand, and we sat there under the stars, letting the silence speak for us. When we returned to Portland, it felt like stepping into a new chapter. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. As I checked my phone, I saw a message from Evan. I hope you've found your happiness, Helen. He's a lucky man. I froze, staring at the screen as a flood of emotions washed over me, regret, gratitude, and a quiet sense of closure. Evan had been a part of my journey, a reminder of the vitality and passion I had lost. But Jack had been my partner through it all, the man I had chosen, and the one I still wanted to choose. I didn't reply to Evan's message. Instead, I deleted it. Deleting the message wasn't just an action, it was a decision, a statement to myself that I was ready to move forward. Evan had shown me a side of myself I had forgotten, but Jack was the one who had stood by me every step of the way. And no matter how difficult it might be, I wanted to hold on to that. I set down my phone and walked into the living room, where Jack was waiting. This wasn't the end. It was a beginning. A chance to rebuild something imperfect but deeply true. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had made the right choice.